Welcome to the Sustainable Clinical Medicine Podcast. I am your host, Sarah Smith. I am a practicing rural family physician and the charting coach. This is the podcast for physicians and advanced practice providers who are ready to step back from the busyness of their clinical day to share ideas, question everything, and redesign their clinical day. We are redesigning clinical medicine to create sustainable clinical days and create time for our lives outside of medicine. Join us for discussions with world experts who are helping design sustainable models of clinical medicine and the physicians or clinicians who have discovered or designed sustainable models of clinical medicine for themselves. Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back. Today we have Mr. Ron Richard with us, who's going to give us a perspective a little different. So I'm excited to hear about this. Welcome. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, my name's Ron Richard. My background is I was a clinician in a hospital as a respiratory therapist and later went into emergency medicine and became a paramedic. And so over my 8 years working in the hospital, took care of a lot of different patients that had mostly respiratory complications, COPD, asthma, were on ventilators or just needed breathing treatments and so on and so forth. And I really enjoyed my time there, but eventually I met a person that worked for a manufacturer of medical devices, and he invited me to become part of a think tank with their company and do consulting with them, which led me to then develop CPAP machines and masks and different types of ventilators, sleep diagnostic devices, and then most recently in my career, I've been working a lot with wearables that patients can wear and get feedback on how they're doing, like heart rate variability, AFib, all kinds of different things.
Interesting. So tell us about you as a respiratory therapist way back in the day. What was your experience like doing clinical duties, and what was happening there that created that desire to go and become something different?
Yeah, well, for anybody that's been a respiratory therapist, it's it has its ups and downs during the day. You can be just everything's running smooth, and then all of a sudden you get a code blue and you've got to run, with a crash cart to a different part of the hospital. And I was part of the resuscitation team, and so you never had a day the same, one after another. And so that's one thing I enjoyed about that. I enjoyed engaging with different patients and meeting people, trying to help them figure out, a pathway from where they were at and why they got admitted to the hospital. And then at the end of my career in the hospital, I actually was in charge of discharging patients who were on ventilators and getting them home and getting them acclimated to be living at home with a caregiver or parents or their wife or whoever, teaching them how to take care of this person now that they're ventilator dependent. A lot of patients that I dealt with were quadriplegics. And so that was rewarding in and of itself to be able to get people out away from the hospital environment and back more into a different living kind of a situation.
Yeah. What about your day? Any thing about the day that was more difficult or challenging for you, that was impacting your life outside of the medical field?
Yeah, I told you I'd written a book called Someday is Today. And one of the examples in there, when I was working in the hospital with people that were on ventilators, they were oftentimes intubated. We didn't do a lot of mass ventilation back then. They were typically intubated and then put on a ventilator. And the first thing I noticed was the difficulty they had in communicating with family or with the staff, just asking for simple things. And so
Mm.
in uh, in my desire to try to help these patients, I developed a communication board, which is a real simple device. It has the most often requested things that patients wanted, and put it on a
Mm.
board, and then the nurse or the parents or the caregiver, whoever the family was, would use that to communicate with someone that was on a ventilator and had lost their ability to speak. So the hospital that I worked at was a teaching hospital, and they were gracious and good enough to help support and fund that project. It took me about 6 months of doing interviews with actual patients, collecting a lot of data and information about what are the most desired or things that you would want to, if you could talk, what would you be asking for?
Mm.
And that's what spawned that project. I went on then with the permission of the hospital and commercialized that product, and it went on to sell over 100,000 units over about a 10-year period. So I did a licensing agreement with a company in Kansas City, and they took the project on and the product and developed it further, and then basically were the major distributor for it worldwide. But yeah, it helped a lot of patients. And again, it was simple, inexpensive way to alleviate some of the frustration and anxiety that patients experience who all of a sudden you and I are talking, and if we couldn't speak, it changes your whole world.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, respiratory therapy, you think about breathing, but communicating is also such an important piece of patient care and advocacy for themselves, or that communication piece. Yeah. So,
Yep.
so helpful. Now that's a whole nother job within a job by the sounds of it, interviewing patients and families and developing and innovating. Where did you find time for that?
Uh, Again, I had a really great supervisor at the hospital, and they knew the work I was doing in this area. They had a big heart for it, and so they would let me take time during the day during my shifts to speak with patients either after they'd been extubated or taken off the ventilator, and then they could after a day or so get used to speaking again. Because after you've been intubated for a while, you lose some of the strength in your vocal cords, and that was one of the things I recognized was I didn't interview people unless they were able to speak again fairly easily without, getting them exhausted.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, and then the other part of it too was, seeing people, obviously a lot of people die when they're on ventilators. I mean, that's the
Mm.
sad part about it, and that's the tough part of the job. And then trying to work with the family to make it as easy as possible to transition from the hospital environment, outside. And then the success stories are the ones that, live and survive, and they sometimes do come back and require some additional treatment and things like that. So I developed, friendships with a lot of my patients, as a
Yeah.
lot of doctors do, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. And it contributes to some of that heartbreak as well that you see in medicine, for sure. Those stories that really hit you in the feels. Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Did you have much resistance to the ideas you were proposing to, because this is new, you said supportive supervisors who were happy. Did it take a lot of communication and to express the ideas and advocate for what you were wanting to do?
No, it was actually pretty easy because there was an apparent need for something like this, a
Mhm.
communication device or whatever that was not electronic, not expensive, easy to use. And after the head of nursing saw it, and some of the other physicians saw the prototypes that I was making, and they actually saw them being utilized there in the hospital, it was pretty free sailing. And I was, pleased to be able to then go on, like I say, and commercialize the product.
Mhm. Were you able to personally commercialize the product and market it yourself, or was this had to be under the banner of the hospital? How did that kind of work out from a business point of view?
Yeah, so I have a consulting company and I deal a lot with doctors and clinicians who are inventors. And that's one of the first things I ask them is, how did you come up with the idea, and is it something that you've shared with the hospital, and did you develop it on the time that you're working, and did the hospital contribute any money or resources for you to develop this? And if the answer is yes to any of those questions, I caution them to basically go back to the hospital and get an agreement in place that's either bilateral or through non-disclosure, in addition to some hospitals are pretty easy to work with, and they ask the inventor that if you do go on and commercialize this, uh, they require that a percentage of the sales are given
Mm-hmm.
back to the hospital. and then those funds are utilized in a lot of different ways. But it clears then the runway for the inventor to go outside the hospital and then work with either a manufacturer, or in some cases I've seen inventors start their own companies. They get a startup. Eventually, then they leave the hospital and they're running a full-time business with multiple employees.
Interesting. Interesting. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment because I'm sure others are interested to hear that. Okay, what took you into paramedics and the emergency department? What made you want to switch out of what you were doing before we moved to inventor?
Well, part of it was I was lucky enough to become one of the first licensed paramedics probably in Kansas. That's where I practiced, was in Wichita. And the college there actually was the first school in the Midwest to offer a full-blown paramedic training program, and brought in instructors from all over the United States that had expertise in teaching and training and had run fire departments or had run ambulance services and things like that. So I got registered through the college that I was going to, Wichita State. And then when my supervisors heard about this and they saw the training I was going through, they actually allowed me, or really prompted me to work in the emergency room at the hospital. So part of my daily routine would be to go down to the ER and spend 2 or 3 hours just working with patients that were admitted with respiratory insufficiency or respiratory failure, and apply both my respiratory therapy background and the paramedic component to it. So it was really interesting to see, both sides of that. And as you said earlier, breathing's a very important part of our daily living. So it was easy to merge the two, the emergency medicine stuff along with respiratory care.
Okay. Now, I'm going to say that in emergency departments, there's a number of egos. And I think that where I've worked previously, because I'm more rural, we didn't have an RT as part of respiratory therapist as part of our usual team in regards to a code blue. So that might make it seem odd that I'm asking this question, but you show up in an emergency department with RT background and now paramedic, and there's nurses and there's doctors and everybody's working and RTs. How did they respond to that? How did they place you into their flow of work?
Hmm.
What did that look like?
Well, the first thing I did notice that there are egos, and there's a structure and an ecosystem in the emergency
Yes.
room, and
Yes.
nurses RNs pretty much run that, and then they report to obviously a medical director. And one of the common things that you often see in the emergency room is ventilators. And ventilators are not that easy to operate. So when you mention you're in a rural area and as a doctor or nurse, you have to know a lot of different things, because if you don't have a specialist like a respiratory therapist there to turn the knobs and set the tidal volume and the flow and all these different parameters that are on a ventilator, it gets pretty confusing and a little overwhelming for a nurse or a doctor to do those types of things. So after the ego kind of thing went down, it was like, oh, this is a very useful part of our department if we can have somebody that's got these types of skills and understands not only emergency medicine but how to run a ventilator or different types of breathing machines. Uh, and then it eventually became, I was training other respiratory therapists to work in the emergency room, and it was a 24/7 type of thing. So they always wanted a therapist down there.
Right. Okay. So for them, it was part of the culture that we have a respiratory therapist, and they're very useful to you because that means you can drop the mental load of the ventilator and we'll take over that part for you so you can get on with the other parts of what you have to do. I see how that would slot in once we understand what you do. Yeah.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. So that makes sense about the culture and how you kind of moved into that area. All right. So it was more, you had the experience, you had this new training come about. It seemed to fit well with what you liked doing, and away you went.
Hmm. Yeah.
Fantastic.
It was, and I think for when I got into the paramedic school, I just saw so many opportunities for respiratory therapists to do that same pathway and broaden their experience by getting that education and knowledge. So, and that was kind of a new field. that was emerging because, you know, back when I was working in the hospital, and probably you saw this too, a lot of fire departments and ambulances were staffed by volunteers or people in the local community that
Hmm.
had a heart for doing that kind of thing and
Hmm.
had some ability, but really had no professional training or background in that. They could have been a barber, they could have been a farmer or a plumber or
Hmm.
whatever. So, um, and then, the training and everything became a lot more formalized. And, now you have paramedics. You have to be a paramedic now to be a fireman. I mean, that in the state of California where I live, you can't be accepted into a fire department unless first you've gone through paramedic training.
Wow. Yeah, that really changes the skill set of the people responding.
Hmm. Yeah, and
Mm.
it's good too because they're responding to emergencies with car accidents and things like that, along with, putting out, fires.
Yeah. Yeah. And so you're getting that pre-hospital care optimized.
Hmm.
And this was on the cutting edge of that, the very beginning of that. So fascinating. Was there much from the volunteers who were there, from the non-paramedics who were still in the field? Was there any, were you seeing challenges or resistance with regards to fitting into there? Because they were previously first aid scoop and run, presumably, if they're
Hmm.
not doing pre-hospital care, critical care. What was that dynamic like?
Again, it was sort of like getting into the emergency room. There are people and they've got their own little sandbox that they're going to play in, and they feel like, hey, I'm already doing a good job at this. Why do I
Mm-hmm.
have to get a credential, or why do I have to go to school because I've been doing this for 10 years or whatever, and now you're telling me that I have to go become a credentialed paramedic. And I don't want to go to the trouble of going to school or doing that. And eventually, those people were uh, replaced by credentialed therapists and EMTs.
Yeah. It sounds like you're not frightened of the beginnings of new things.
No, no, and I've owned and operated my own businesses, and I've had a lot of great successes, but also a lot of failures in doing so, and trying to be, the old saying, pioneers get shot with a lot of arrows. And I've had my fair share of arrows shot into me from trying things that sometimes did not work out all that well. And that's a big part of the book that I've written
Yeah.
is don't be afraid to try new things, but also do it with some bit of skepticism. And one of the chapters in the book talks about why does my product or invention have a right to survive in the ecosystem or in the market? You may
Yeah.
think you have a great idea, but until you prove it over and over and over again, and it's sustainable, like you talk about sustainable clinical benefits. One of the things that I learned when I got into sleep back in 1991, I really didn't know much about sleep apnea
Mhm.
even as a respiratory therapist or a paramedic. You really didn't understand. I didn't have a clear understanding of it. But as I started to get into sleep and develop CPAP machines and different diagnostic things for uh, discovering whether you had sleep apnea or not, the sustainable clinical component to treating somebody successfully with CPAP has enormous benefits in terms of the cardiovascular system. Their blood pressure would go down, their heart rate would go down, they'd lose weight, they would wake up and feel energetic, could go exercise instead of taking, a nap every 2 or 3 hours. So that's when I really started to see if you create these types of therapies that are proven, they can
Mhm.
significantly improve outcomes and they have a sustainable life over, I've seen patients that have been using CPAP for 10 or 15 or 20 years and with good results.
Yeah. Were you in business or doing anything in that field prior to becoming a respiratory therapist?
No, I owned and operated a company that did we worked primarily with stereo equipment and electronics, and we did installations in airplanes and in automobiles and things like that. So I had a specialized company that did mobile. stereo, as well as we would go into homes and build out like home theaters back in the
Hmm.
day.
Yeah.
So I've always been interested in music. I'm a musician too, and I toured and traveled all over the place playing shows. But a big part of my early days was my fascination with listening to records and music.
Okay, so this is prior to becoming an RT,
Yeah. Yep.
musician, businessman in the technology field, installing speakers, installing sound systems, doing musical performances. That's already a big pre-clinical career.
Yeah, it got me ready to do something else, something in a hospital, and I had a friend that worked in the hospital, and that's how I got introduced to respiratory therapy. Is he kept asking me, "Why don't you come and visit and just kind of see what we do? I think you might like it."
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
sure enough, I went around with them and put on a white coat and followed him around the hospital for a couple of days. And I said, "Yeah, I think I would like to apply for a job." And then I went to through school, and I'd actually been interested and did a lot of pre-med courses because I was thinking about being a physician assistant.
Hmm. Wow. Okay. So we've got this fascination with medicine. We've got business side of you. You're then seeing patients and saying, okay, they need to communicate better and developing a communication tool. Then you're like, I need a new skill set. I can do more with what I already have. Becomes paramedic first, like leading brand new course, and you're in it. And then you say you're approached by companies. How does that happen? How do you get approached by companies to develop and innovate something new?
Well, going back to when I developed that communication board, I was contacted by someone at a journal, a respiratory journal, and they'd heard about what I worked on. So I ended up writing a white paper, and it got
Mm-hmm.
published. And after it was published, I got contacted by a medical manufacturing company in Kansas City that was interested in licensing and distributing that product. So
Mm-hmm.
that was my first encounter with the what I call medical manufacturing world, and I really got fascinated by that and how the engineering and how you take a concept or an idea and then eventually transform that and commercialize it. And so I ended up getting a degree in business administration and then started working on my master's, which I never finished, but I I really enjoyed product development, product management, and again, that's another whole chapter in my book about how to take something from an idea, from a concept to commercialization and getting it on the market.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it happens overnight or particularly quickly from the sounds of
No.
this.
And one of the questions that I posed with you that I discussed, with other people is it getting easier or is it getting more difficult to innovate and to get products on the market?
Mm-hmm.
And there's two parts to that. One is it is getting more difficult because the FDA now is being more stringent and strict about particularly things that you breathe on in terms of does it pass off particles? Is it toxic? Is there
Mm-hmm.
any kind of leachability to the plastic or whatever's
Mm-hmm.
coming in contact with your airway?
Mm-hmm.
So there's recently been a lot of recalls in the respiratory world, for instance, and now that's really red flag for the FDA is to be a lot more cognizant of the fact that if you're on a CPAP machine and you've been breathing on it for 3 or 4 years and then you start to, cough and you may get
Mm-hmm.
cancer, now they're starting to link, oh, okay, well, there's something in that machine that is
Mm-hmm.
giving off some sort of element that's now getting into your lungs and you're breathing this toxic fumes in or whatever. And so that's taking longer because the toxicology testing, for instance, and the leachability and all those tests that are being performed are done by special labs like Nelson Labs or labs up in Minnesota that have this incredibly expensive testing gear. And the tests can take anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 or 3 months because they have to incubate all these different chemicals and components, and then at the end create a report. about what the
Mm,
findings are. So that's one of the things that lengthens what I call the time to market, and you just have to
mm,
factor that into your project plan. On the flip side, though, the innovation in 3D printing has now enabled inventors or manufacturers to actually get functional, workable prototypes in place much quicker than they could do 10 years ago. So that innovation has accelerated in part how you can maybe speed up certain elements and parts of the project plan is by utilizing 3D printers. And the other thing that's being now uh, more refined and put into practice is using artificial intelligence, particularly if you're doing clinical trials, to try to filter your patient population to
mhm,
who you think are going to be the best match for the drug that you're going to be testing or the product, a medical device or whatnot. And so AI is becoming more and more used, even though it's been around since the 1950s. All of a sudden, they changed the terminology to, make this as like this big buzzword. But I started working with AI back in 20, 2010 with IBM with the Watson project, and it was a super computer system. And now, you got the computing part of it down to where, it's smaller, it's faster. You've got server farms and all kinds of things that integrate data. And it's all about combining analytics and then getting some kind of reasonable, sensible, and reproducible outcome that's highly
mhm,
predictable.
mm. That takes me to a question you had about wearables and patient monitoring that could be happening and used more readily by clinicians and physicians in their workplace with their patients, for instance. I mean, to have people being able to do hemodialysis at home, for instance, and have somebody in an office somewhere watching all of the people at home doing dialysis, it's incredible.
Hmm.
And we talk about flexibility within our workforces as a increases the capacity of the workforce because of that ability for people to do jobs just a little bit outside of what they used to do. But then we've got a complete replacement for some of the parts. Like you don't have to have a nurse going out to the home to do a blood pressure and a SATS monitor on a patient at home because they can have things at home. Tell us more about these wearables that you're kind of noticing.
Yeah, so I had a great experience. I got to work at Fitbit. I don't know if you've ever heard of Fitbit, but I got to work on a watch that
Yeah,
could detect sleep apnea and heart rate variability. And this was back in 2014.
right.
And so that's evolved now to where Samsung and Apple and all these companies have watches that you can wear, and it shows you your steps, which is pretty basic. But looking at saturation, heart rate variability, and the quality of sleep, I think it gives patients or people that are using wearables, it gives them some immediate feedback to make fine-tuning adjustments to their lifestyles of like, oh, okay, I see, I drank two Cokes before I went to bed and I didn't sleep very good. My heart rate variability was bad.
Yeah.
My saturation was okay, but my sleep hygiene issues, I've got to start, doing something different. And so if you have that feedback from the wearable, I call it the Internet of Things, and you've got somebody like the big thing in sleep right now is there's a lot of job openings for people that can go to courses and become a sleep coach. And what
Mm-hmm.
they do is they get online with you, like we're doing now, and talk to you about, well, what's bothering you about your sleep hygiene and go through. It
Mm-hmm.
could be insomnia, it could be my legs are twitching, it could be I'm
Mm-hmm.
snoring and I'm bothering my spouse or whatever. There's all kinds of things, but sleep coaches, that's a big emerging part of the sleep industry that a nurse or a respiratory therapist could do a side gig and make, some additional money, and it's pretty rewarding as well. But the things that I kind of also most recently worked on in terms of wearables, there's a lot of rings that you can wear now, and believe it or not, you can get very accurate heart rate. You can get SpO2, you can get a number of different physiological metrics off of that, and then that's uploaded, through the beauty of a cloud and using either Bluetooth or Wi-Fi, that's where all the connectivity is coming. And I really envision, like right now, I'm working on a remote monitoring project with a big company, and all we do is we monitor truck drivers that have sleep apnea, and we're doing it all remotely. And we have sleep coaches in place. We have a medical director that can take, questions and things like that. But it's enabled truck drivers to continue to do their job and do it safely. And it's, reduced accidents by 80-90%.
Wow. Fascinating, cutting edge kind of places to be working. Yeah.
Hmm.
And then did you mention that you work with other clinicians and physicians in that inventor stages or setting up their business? How does that work?
It's usually people that have talked to other clients that I've worked with, so it's referral, word of mouth, or they go online and they look up books about, inventions, and then they find me
Hmm.
and they go to my website and schedule an appointment. So primarily I don't do any pharmaceuticals. I just do all
Hmm.
device inventions,
Devices.
and I
Yeah.
pretty much specialize in respiratory and sleep.
Right. Okay. And what are you noticing about the people who are coming up with these ideas? Are they like you that they're noticing that the patients would do better if, or is that the type of, how does innovation come about? How does invention come about?
Well, the exciting thing to me, because of my experience with that communication board, is the same thing. It's the seed that's planted in a clinician's mind that's always thinking about how can we do this better? How can we advance the device that I'm using now? It works okay, but it could be improved. And so what they
Hmm.
do is they tinker around and make these improvements and come up with what I call an evolutionary process. It's not revolutionary. It's evolving something that was made maybe back in the 1950s or 60s, and no one's really taken the time to improve on it. So, yeah, a lot of the clinicians, and I think they're the best people to actually design and do inventions like this and evolve products, is because every day they're working with something that they're dealing with patients, and they hear the complaints, they hear the frustration from the patient. It's like, yeah, it does
Mm.
help me, but it's really not that easy to use.
Yeah. 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 And we hear that a lot. It
Hmm.
just takes a certain person to say, well, let's make that better, or I think I could make that better, or I wonder how to make that better. It's not everybody.
No, because a lot, I'd say some people go to work every day and they just use whatever they're given, and they're taught in medical school or in nursing or whatever. This is the syringe and the needle, and this is the medication, and you give somebody a shot or whatever, or give them a breathing treatment, and you don't really think too much outside the box. But there are clinicians who they use both parts of their brain, their right side and their left side, so they're creative and inventive and they're curious, and I think they truly have the best interest of the patient at heart, to improve the experience that the patient is having with whatever product they're using. So, they kind of look at something and go, well, have you ever thought about doing it this way?
Hmm.
Because I'll tell you, medical manufacturers, and I've worked for Fortune 500 companies and small startups, engineering people typically, it's like you want to connect a wire from point A to point B in the fastest way, and you don't really care or think about how easy it is to do, or is it very expensive or anything like that. You just want to get your job done as an engineer. So a lot of engineers don't really take into consideration, well, how does it really make the patient feel? And does the patient really like it? I mean, it may work, but have you thought about making it softer? Or like when I was working a lot with CPAP masks, the common
Mm.
complaint was my nose hurts up here.
Mm.
The mask is
Mm.
hurting my face. So a lot of advancements were made, and what I started doing was taking engineers out to hospitals or out to home care companies, and to do focus groups with patients and let them ask them questions. Well, what if we made this way? Like the headgear or the mask made it
Hmm.
softer. But like, oh my gosh, that was eye-opening, that the engineers would go, well, we'll do that.
Yeah. I think I can hear clinicians and physicians everywhere in the world saying, please send the engineers out to watch me work in my electronic medical record.
Right. Yeah, your EMRs are my wife's a doctor, and she said the most frustrating part about her job anymore is charting.
Yeah.
She
Yeah.
spends 80% of her time charting and 20% actually taking care of patients.
Yes, yes. And it's not just the recording of what happened in the chart note, it's all of the pieces that take a keystroke, right?
Hmm.
So just getting the information in, um, there's tools being developed for some of that, but it's the everything about the workflow of the day, that you can clearly see that this wasn't invented for us,
No,
right?
and kind of an element that I see, and my wife and I talked about this over the weekend, and I asked her, I said, do you see AI ever taking a part in the more mundane parts of your job, like charting, for instance?
Mm.
Is there some way AI could maybe help reduce your frustration with, I'd like to spend more time with my patients, but if I get behind on
Mm.
charting, then it's like this thing whole spirals
Mhm.
out of control. So
Mhm.
she said, yeah, I could see that, but then I have to think about what's the legal ramifications if I use AI incorrectly and
Mhm.
it misdiagnoses or it does something that is going to come back to
Mhm.
me later in sort of a legal way.
Yeah. 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 No, it's a fascinating, and we hope that there are innovators out there who are thinking about both the clinicians, physicians, and the patients, right? Because both are, as we move and change things, we're hoping to increase sustainability or increase compliance for patients or increase quality of life for either of us. It's so very important. Innovation continues to happen. Ron, how do people contact you or get in touch with you if they have this great idea, they want to move forward in something? What's the best place to find you? What is your book?
The name of the book is Someday is Today, and the subtitle, I actually got it from a doctor that I talked to at Stanford. I did a lecture there about how to get innovation, into your daily practice, into your life, and create, maybe some income from you. And he said, I have all these great ideas, but they're in my coffee cup on my desk. But I don't know how to get them out. So that's the subtitle: is get your ideas out of your coffee cup and on the market.
Yeah.
And it just talks about taking action. The simple step, the first step is to take action. Write your idea down. But you can get a hold of me through my website, inventingstartstoday.com, and I have a calendar on there, and you can just request consult.
Yeah. I mean, curious about recalls. You mentioned recalls and potential litigation. How do, because I think that might even like paralyze or stop the whole idea moving forward for a lot of people is what if it doesn't work or it harms people? What if there's litigation? What if there's recall? How do you answer that question?
The best way to mitigate that is to take a conservative approach to what you're developing. So I'll go back to the word evolutionary versus revolutionary, and I talk about that and define it in the book. And when I hear somebody come to me with an invention, then they use the word, it's going to revolutionize medicine. It gives me goosebumps. It's kind of like, so how are you going to prove this? Because things that are revolutionary, typically there could be more risk involved with it than
Mhm.
something that's evolutionary, because an evolutionary project or product to me is taking something that's already been proven and fine tuning it and enhancing it or making it better in certain, patient comfort, things
Yeah.
like that. So that's a big part of it, is like, what are you trying to accomplish? What are your main goals? I always tell people, you've got to come up with a 30-second elevator pitch about your idea. You can't talk to me for 10 minutes to try to explain to me and convince me I've got this wonderful, great invention. It's like, tell me in 30 seconds what it does, how it's going to help people, is it
Yeah.
more cost effective or whatever. And so, yeah, in this litigious environment that we're in, I caution people. Number one is make sure you have a good patent attorney and you
Hmm.
you do a thorough patent search. I was working with a client once for almost a year, and I just assumed he'd gone to a patent attorney, and we've been
Yeah.
working through prototypes and all this, and then one day that topic came up with some conversation, and he was like, I've never gone through the process of filing a patent or having a patent search done. And I was like, oh my gosh, put the brakes on here. Let's stop
Yeah.
everything and because you could go to market with a product, start selling it, and then get sued because you've
Mhm.
infringed on somebody else's patents.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Good advice. Thank you. Because I think that might help people who have an idea, but they don't want to even start because they're worried. But no,
Hmm.
you've got some advice on there are ways to do this more sensibly, uh, with potentially less risk or with at least understood risk. So
Hmm.
yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anything else for people who have who recognize themselves as an innovative person? They've got no interest in moving something forward, but they'd like to pull ideas out into the world, or anything else for those people who use both sides of their brain, as you say,
Hmm.
what you would recommend for them?
That was part of the talk that I did last week with the University of Jacksonville was there are clinicians or doctors that they don't want to get involved in an invention or a product development process. So for them, what I tell them is if you have a contact at a pharmaceutical company or at a medical manufacturer, that there's certain devices that you like and you say, that's a real high quality company. Their sales
Mhm.
reps are great. Their clinical people are great. All you have to do is just start a conversation with somebody there and say, you know, I have really got an interest in being involved with, maybe you've got a panel of doctors
Mhm.
that work with your company. Could I be an advisor? Get on your advisor committee and be a consultant. And who would I contact or who could I call at your company to introduce myself and give them my CV? And I've seen that turn into it's lucrative in terms of doing
Mhm.
speaking at conferences and things like that. But then they also get involved with a steering committee to help with developing a clinical protocol. And if they're involved in a hospital and it's okay with the administrator, they could become part of a clinical trial for a medical manufacturer. And at the end of the day, this doctor or clinician has helped now innovate and come, they didn't have to do all the engineering and all that kind of
Mhm.
stuff, but they're an integral part of a team and they're a
Yeah.
valued asset. And so I encourage people if they have a desire to expand their horizons and, create a little bit of income on the side, just talk to your sales rep or talk to the manufacturer rep or the clinician person that is coming in helping you at the hospital. Introduce yourself and to say, I've got an interest in getting involved with your company.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you so
Hmm.
much for this conversation. I think it's really helped those of you who always look at something and say, this could be better, or those of you who are like, I could go and do something interesting in the world. So
Hmm.
thank you very much for this
Yeah.
conversation, Roman.
Thank you, Dr. Smith.
You guys have a wonderful rest of your week, everyone. Bye.
Bye bye.
Thank you for being part of the Sustainable Clinical Medicine podcast. If you'd like to learn more or join us to help you get home with today's work done, go to chartingcoach.ca. There you'll find all the information on the Premier Lifetime Access Charting Champions program that is helping physicians get home with today's work done, with all the proven tools, support, and community you need to create time for your life outside of medicine. We would love to see you there. Until next time, thanks for listening.